what I want to be able to do is to specify which request type this get user should use. So if we have get, we have post, we have, let's say, cookie, we have session, I want to be able to say strictly which one the data should be fetched from. Let's say get user from post, or get user from the get Superglobal, or session perhaps, or cookie, and so on. Okay, so for now, let's just remove it from this obviously argument because we haven't got functionality ready yet. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to pass the new argument to this getName function, which is going to be called type. And I'm going to specify it as null by default. And what's going to happen here is basically what I'm going to do next is to overwrite it. So we're going to have this type equals, and we are going to call get request type function, which we haven't got yet, and we'll pass the type which we have been given through the function argument, basically. So let's create this get request type. And now one important thing which I haven't mentioned yet, you can write your function in whichever order you want. So the fact that we are actually using this get request type inside of the getName doesn't mean that I have to define it before getName. I can define it after the getName, I can define it at the end of the file if I want to. Because the way PHP parser works, it basically goes through the entire code, then it basically processes the code so it knows where the function is, if it's available at all. But for the sake of this exercise, let's just type it actually at the beginning of the file before all these functions are basically defined. So I'm going to create a new function called get request type, and we are going to again use type argument. By default it will be null, because by default we will simply use the request Superglobal. So we are going to check if, and we are going to check is null, and we are passing our argument here. So if type is null, then simply return, and we are going to use the request Superglobal. So we know that if it's null, if we don't pass any argument when we are calling this method, then the default request type will be simply request, which obviously will fetch either get, post, or cookie. Okay, so that's the first one handled. So if it's null, we know that we're going to get the request Superglobal. Next, we are going to check if is array and the type, or, so double two of those vertical bars, is underscore callable, basically if it's of a call, if it's a function, let's say if it's a method of the class or anything like this. And again, we need to obviously pass the argument, this type argument which we've been given, then return type straight away. We don't have to process it anyway because it's ready to be returned. And this will become more obvious in just a moment. Next we are going to check if, and then exclamation mark, we're checking if it's not a string. So is underscore string, and we pass in the type as argument again. So if the argument is not of the string type, then we are simply going to terminate the script using the die statement, die, and we are going to return the message the request type needs to be either of a string, comma, array, or closure data type, and full stop, and then semicolon. So if it's not going to be, if it's not an array, if it's not a callable, if it's not null, and if it's not a string, then obviously someone typed in the incorrect argument when calling this specific function. In which case we want to terminate straight away here. We don't want this code to go any further. Okay, but if all these conditions returned false, then we are going to create an array of available types. So available types. And it's entirely up to you which ones you want to use. I'm going to go for the post, so the index is going to be simply post. I'm going to simplify them, just put the lowercase without the $ underscore, so post. And then I'm going to associate the Superglobal with them. Obviously we are creating array again here, as you can see, square brackets starting and closing one. The next one will be get, and for this one it's going to be a get Superglobal. For cookie, we will have cookie Superglobal. And lastly, we are going to use session. And these are the only ones we are going to be interested in. But with the session, I can't simply use session like this, Because first of all, for the session, whenever we call session, we have to first check if session actually has started, if it's set. So in order to be able to do it, we are going to return a closure, the anonymous function, in other words. So function, and in between the brackets, we are going to type return is set, and we check if the session has been set, in which case we return it. Otherwise, we are again going to terminate the script using the die function, and we are going to say session has not been started, and a semicolon at the end of the statement. Again, condition for true and for false. Basically, that's obviously the shorthand, as we have been using this quite several times now. And let's just do the indent here. We can indent this one as well, so everything's in line. Okay, so for the session, we simply return the callable or closure, in other words, because obviously anonymous functions are called closures, but they are also from within the callable group. That's why we are checking here if it is of an array type, because all of these superglobals are of an array type, as you may remember, or is callable, which would basically satisfy this condition here for this closure, because closure is of a callable type, then simply return it, which would mean that we have already called this request type before. And you will see again the usage of this in just a moment when we actually apply this to another function. So we have these available types and what they should return when we actually pass one of these keys as an argument. So now let's do another check. If, and we are going to use the exclamation mark, array underscore key exists. Obviously we're checking for the opposite. So we're checking if it does not exist with this exclamation mark. And we are checking for our type, which we got through the argument. Obviously we processed it already. We checked basically if any of these conditions is true. If it was, obviously, sorry, these three here. If it was, obviously it would terminate earlier and we obviously would return something. But because all these three have returned false, that's why we are following lower down the line, basically, and we are getting to this if statement here. So we are checking if the key does not exist in this available types array. If it does not exist, that means someone has put in the incorrect request type. So let's simply use this die statement again, and let's say invalid request type provided, and then semicolon. So if someone typed in, let's say, cookies rather than cookie, this would be triggered. Okay, next we need to check if the given, basically the given type by its index is of a callable type. And in our array, the only one is that is callable is actually session. But let's check if, and then is underscore callable. And we're going to go for this available types, and we're using this index of the type, which is basically corresponding to this indexes on the left here, obviously, because that's what this type should contain. And then if it is callable, we can either return it on the same line. I'm going to put it on the new line because this line is going to become a little bit longer. Then return, and we are going to go for call, user func, and we go for available types, and again, index type. So we basically, what we're doing here, we are triggering this function. We are trying to get what this function actually returns. So we're returning what this function returns by simply calling this function, executing it, in other words, by the use of this call user func. Okay, so that's this. Otherwise, we simply return the available types and then the type. So it's going to give us one of those superglobals, basically, so we can work on this. Okay, so that's everything inside of this function. Now what we need to do is basically replace this request inside of this get name, and then we're gonna go to the other ones as well, with the type rather than this hard-coded, obviously this request superglobal, because now we will have, we might have request, we might have post, we can have get, cookie, or the session, depending on what we pass through as an argument for this type. So now simply use type, type, type again, type, and that should now work fine with this get name. Again, remember, this type will be one of those superglobals, basically, because this is what we're returning from this get request type function. Okay, so that's this one. Let's go for the get town. Do the same one, type by default null. And then we are going to use the same function. So type equals get, it was request type, and we pass in this type as argument. So this type can be processed and return the Superglobal which we after. And then obviously replace this request with this one. So that's dynamically actually using the right Superglobal. And the same for the get user, type null by default. And again, we are using this type equals get request type, passing the type as argument, and then we checking if this given request does not exist, and then basically we are passing this. We need to pass them to these functions as well, so they are aware of this type as well, obviously. But now this is where, if I just split the screen and scroll right to the top, this is where all these check here for the is array and is callable comes into play, because we have already processed this specific type. After being given this type through the get user function, we've processed it once with this get request type, and we have the right result here. Then we check in obviously if it's the correct one, obviously if it exists, basically, if it has been set. Sorry, no, it hasn't been set. We check in if it actually exists. If it's a request, obviously we would check for get, post, or cookies. If it's any of these, we would check for the specific one. Obviously with this exclamation mark, we are making sure that it does not. So if it's not, then we return this missing Superglobal variable, basically the right one. But then we are passing this processed Superglobal already to this get name function. As we know, this get name function, again, if we scroll down here, calls this function again. So basically it's like a duplication. That's why right at the beginning here, after checking if it's null, we are straight away checking if it's an array, because if it's an array, we know it's going to be one of those Superglobals already. So this has been processed, so we straight away return it. We don't process it any further. We don't want to do it again. And if it's callable, obviously, for this session, which is obviously the closure here, so we know that if it's callable, okay, that's already been processed. Return it straight away. We don't need to check again if it's of the correct side, because it has been already processed. And obviously, it should return the whatever's been passed through straight away back to the caller. So now that we have all this code, I'm going to close this split window here. What I want to do now is go to this get user and simply use get. For this one, let's check. We want to get user from the URI, basically from the get Superglobal. If we go back to our browser, refresh the page, yes, we want to continue. We're resubmitting the form. And as you can see, even though the form submitted Mark, Spencer, and London, what we got above the form, what we are displaying, what this get user function has returned, is what was in the URI. It's not interesting, even though post usually would override get, but because we specified strictly we want to use get, it only processes get, basically. So it gets values from the URI through the get Superglobal. If we go back to the editor, let's change it to post. If we save it, go back to the browser, refresh the page, reload the page. Yes, now it takes it from the post. As you can see, this is matching what we've typed in here. So it's ignoring the get now. Let's try the same, and let's try this time with, say, cookies. If we save it, preview it in a browser, what we should get, if I refresh the page, is invalid request type provided. And why? Let's go back. Cookies, because I've used cookies rather than cookie hour. If I split window again and scroll right to the top, you can see our index is cookie, not cookies. That's why we got this. If we scroll down, we have invalid request type, because we're checking if array key does not exist, and it doesn't, because we haven't got any cookies, we have cookie. That's why we got this invalid request type. But if we check for the cookies, which we know we haven't set any variables for the cookies, if we refresh the page again, we reload in the form, it tells us the missing Superglobal variable, because we haven't set any variables on this Superglobal cookies. The same is going to be for the session. So if we go back and say session, save it, and preview it in browser again, reload, we resubmit in the form again, and session has not been started. And this is because we haven't used this sessions start basically function at the beginning. You remember when we were talking about session Superglobal. So this is obviously giving us this message here from this closure, die session has not been started, obviously. So this is how all this works now. We can obviously strictly specify which request type we want to use for our request. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a better idea. Obviously, you can do it this way, or you can simply use the previous example which you had with the request. It's entirely up to you. I just thought it's going to be nice to go through this because it's a pretty nice kind of exercise to go through. Obviously, have a better idea of how these super globals might work, especially with the functions like these.